Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here. And since there are Blitz games covered on here from time to time, I thought I would show some as well. But not my own. Rather, the Tom Memorial just got underway, and as a very interesting method for determining the pairing numbers for the real tournament, they had a Blitz tournament the day before. And the top 5 players, well, basically whatever your finish was would be your pairing number, and the top 5 players would get an extra white over the course of the tournament, the bottom 5 the extra black. Now, quite a few of the games were pretty interesting, and so there's some highlights that I've picked out for you, and this is mostly for entertainment, but I think there are some instructive moments in these games as well. So we'll go through these kind of quickly, not all 45 games, but about I think 6 or 7, quickly though. Think of this like a viewer games show, but with world-class grandmasters playing Blitz. So just a tour of the highlights. The first one, actually the first 4 games I'm going to show you are Carlsen's first 4 games in the event, in which he started off with a 3-1 score. The first one is against Luke McShane, and he has white here, Carlsen does. And McShane played rather cheekily here. He played the, I think it's called the Arctic Defense, which is well, frankly, probably a pretty dubious line, but one that Carlsen himself employed a couple of times back in 2010. Once in a Blitz tournament against Boris Sevchenko, which was a game he won, but once in a more important setting against Mickey Adams and Hanti Mansisk, and he lost that game. It was a bit worse. He managed to equalize, and then Adams outplayed him and won. So all of these games started with e5, knight h5, but in the earlier games, when Carlsen had black, it was bishop to e2, d6, and then here Sevchenko played like this, and anyway, Carlsen seemed to be okay here, while Adams played more calmly, kind of in keeping with his style that he generally prefers to keep control rather than make big commitments. And anyway, it's somewhere around here Carlsen was doing just fine. So here, even though white has the bishop here, black's good control over the dark squares on the long diagonal, e5 in particular. Also ideas like knight f5, d4 are there. So he should be okay, but something went wrong at a certain point. And yeah, perhaps this was a bit too ambitious of Carlsen. And at this point, Adams was able to start building and won with decisive attack. So that was the earlier. Those are the earlier games. That was what it looked like when Carlsen had black. But how about when Carlsen had white? What would he do against this this mischievous try by McShane? Well, Carlsen played f4, so he doesn't bother with this knight on h5. He's going to leave it alone and just grab some space. d5 and now c4. And I'm not sure. Well, okay, d5. I mean, it has the idea of trying to treat this something like a modern, where you play maybe knight to g7, knight f5, or better still, wait for white to play bishop to d3, play knight to g7, and then bishop to f5, swap the bishops, and create this light squared fortress. But it doesn't happen. So c5, c6, knight c3, knight g7. You can't play bishop to g7 because g4 costs you a piece, so you have to waste some time. But as long as white doesn't play bishop to d3, black has a real problem with his minor pieces. I mean, the bishop on f8 is stupid until the knight moves, but he doesn't want to move the knight until he's exchanged off his light squared bishop. So that's kind of the problem here. All right, Carlsen plays knight f3, and generally black will reflexively play bishop to g4 in such circumstances. But here he's got to worry about cd5, queen b3, and the loss of a pawn. So he plays h5, queen b3 anyway, e6, and now black is just getting the worst of all possible worlds here. His knight will get the f5 square, but the rest of his minor pieces are going to be very unhappy. Bishop e3, bishop e2, and okay, from here white has finished his development, and he needs to figure out some kind of plan. And he comes up with a very nice one, I think. And we're going to see this in a lot of these games. One of the things in general that I think makes very good players is a knowledge of which pieces to exchange. And here Carlsen, like Fischer, follows a kind of straight line strategic plan. So you swap off the right pieces, and you do so in such a way that it enables you to take care of or to exploit the opponent's structure. So here we see all of these black pawns and light squares, which generally means that the dark squares could become weak. And of course we don't want to trade off black's light squared bishop, but we would be very happy trading off the dark squared one. Well, how do we do that? Bishop h4 comes to mind. But we can't play bishop to h4 right now. I mean, black's got 3 pieces attacking that square. We've only got one backup. So he starts off with c takes d5. Now, if cd, then white will just use the c file to play knight to b5 and start to invade on the queen side. So McShane plays e takes d5. Now bishop to d3. So the idea is to swap off stuff on f5 and then go for bishop to h4 at some moment. So here, knight d1, knight e3, takes, and now there's no real need to swap off this bishop too. So bishop to h4, and so he's achieved what he wanted. Okay, well, McShane, correctly from a strategic point of view, avoids the exchange of the bishops. However, after bishop to f8, now this bishop is in his face on f6, and it's not a matter of strategic issues of good bishops and bad bishops and things like that, but rather the black king can just get itself mated. So after king to g8, white should have played knight h4. This would have been more accurate. And this is a little surprising of Carlsen, but I guess he wanted to just keep the tempo going. But this is better as it keeps the black queen locked in. So after bishop f5, queen f5, knight h4, queen e4, the queen is a slight nuisance, although it's not really going to matter. So f5, maybe black should try taking on d4 and hope that he can gobble and undermine white's pawns before he gets mated. But inevitably, it's too slow. White's got too many attackers. He's got the e pawn, the f pawn, the knight on h4, the bishop on f6, the rook on f1, and the queen and rook from c1 can both swing over to the king side easily enough too. All right, black played knight to d7 rather than grabbing the d pawn. White just goes forward, and now this, and now the last move to find rook f4. So this preserves the knight on h4, and then next white takes on f6 with 2 extra pawns and a lethal attack. So McShane threw in the towel here. All right, so now we know what to do if we ever see the Arctic defense. We just copy Carlsen. Okay, round 2. This is Carlsen against Levon Aronian, one of the few players in the world who is a bit of kryptonite to him, and in fact, really kryptonite to Anand. Anand's score against Aronian is horrible. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's just a very big minus. I mean, you can check out the specifics. I don't remember offhand, but it's serious. Anyway, Carlsen and Aronian have had some good battles, but I think Aronian has come out ahead so far. All right. Well, Aronian plays the Berlin. It's one of his standard openings, along with the Marshall Gambit. And here Carlsen plays a funny sideline. He plays d4. It's not a bad move, but it's not too dangerous either if black knows what he's doing, and of course Aronian knows what he's doing. Alright, well here we have a position that looks kind of like an exchange Rui, but not quite. Alright, so here white is avoiding e5 and just wants to develop, and black is trying to find the most propitious arrangement of his minor pieces. And knight to d1. Knight to d1 I'm not so sure about. I mean, he's avoiding the capture, but it seems that his knights never really find their best squares here. Maybe something like rook a to d1, just keeping up the tempo of the development, would have been a better choice, and not fearing bishop takes c3. I mean, it's black's majority side anyway, so that exchange isn't really too worrisome. Anyway, knight to d1 certainly isn't a terrible move. So c5, knight b3, c4, knight d4, and here perhaps rook to e8 would have been a better choice. So Aronian played c5, and certainly having this pawn on c5 is something he wants, but not necessarily with that bishop sitting on b4. I mean, that's really the question. Is the bishop out of play there? Is it misplaced? All right, Carlsen played knight f5. They swapped. Here maybe queen to f6 is most accurate, but rook to e8 is certainly a plausible looking move. I mean, you've got this open file, Why not put a rook there? All right, Carlsen plays knight f2, and we see one reason is that this knight is going to go to e4, where it will neutralize this open file. All right, one thing maybe black could play here is c3 to prevent white from playing c3. But I suppose Aronian's thought is that if white plays c3, yes, it'll kick the bishop, but it also gives up the d3 square, maybe. All right, also Aronian had a little tricky idea. He played knight to c6. And now the idea is that if c3, he's got knight to d4. And if the queen moves, then he can play rook takes e3 and knight c2. While on cd, he gets his piece back. Although, maybe something like this is, in fact, not so bad for, well, it's playable for both sides. White's up a pawn, but it's a doubled pawn, doubled f pawn. He's got no passers. Black's bishop is back in the game, and black is all right. White's a little bit better, but nothing too serious. So Carlsen played knight e4, which is sensible. Knight to d4, hitting the queen and both the c pawn and the f5 pawn. So takes is semi-forced. Queen takes, king h1, and now white threatens to just play c3 with, or rook a to d1. Well, c3 and then rook a to d1 with a strategically won position. So black has to do something. Taking the pawn is a good idea. a3. Here maybe Aronian should have played bishop to c3 to put the bishop on a good square like d4 or e5, for instance here, with equality. So instead he puts the bishop on a5, which isn't quite as good. And after this series of captures, white's up a pawn. Well, no, material's even, but he's about to be up a pawn because the c5 pawn is going to drop, and in fact did drop here. So white's a bit better, but not that much better. Not as much better as you might think. The knight on e4 is good, but it may not be there forever. Maybe at some point black can play f5. The c2 pawn is weak. The a3 pawn is potentially weak. And also white needs to be a bit careful about his back rank. In fact, when I was watching the game at this point, I felt a little nervous about white's back rank. It seemed like something bad could happen there. And as we'll see, something bad does happen for white. Okay, so here maybe queen to d6 is the best choice, offering a trade of queens. But Carlsen played the centralizing queen d4, which is not an awful move. Okay, bishop to e7 hits the pawn. Rook b6 hits the queen. Queen a2. c4. Here maybe black should play rook a to d8 first, but he took c5, and again white's still a little bit better. Here perhaps white should have just gone forward. Passed pawns must be pushed. But he plays rook to a1, which is a very natural move. Hitting the queen, which is just about trapped, and trying to stop the a5 pawn as well. All right, so here Aronian has no real choice. He's got to do something to counterattack white's queen, or he just loses his own. So rook a to d8. And now, well, what does white do? He's thinking, okay, if I play queen c3, then black just trades and plays bishop c5, for instance. I guess I could play queen to g1, but that's not a very appealing square for the queen. So, well, here we go. Why don't we just play knight to d6? So this looks pretty good. Still threatening the queen. The queen is still trapped, after all. We're threatening the rook, kind of. And maybe queen d5 or queen f4, something like that will come next. And it looks like white is doing great. But Aronian is, if nothing if not a very, very tricky player, especially when it comes to nasty tactical tricks, and he has one here. He plays bishop to f6. The problem is that white just has this kind of checker pattern on the board where all of his goodies are ready to be captured on diagonals. So after rook a3, which is forced, bishop takes d4, black threatens rook to e1 mate, and he threatens bishop takes c5, which attacks everything. Attacks both rooks and the knight. So, well, no problem. Knight takes e8. We're a full rook up here. And if rook takes e8, no big deal. We can play rook to b1. And we're up the exchange. We can play for the win. Well, sorry about that. There's bishop takes c5. And again, everything is threatened. The knight on e8 is threatened. Both rooks and rook to d1 mate are all there. So Carlsen tries one last roll of the dice here with rook to d6, hoping that maybe Aronian will play bishop takes d6, and then there's rook to d3, and I don't know if he can survive that, but maybe, or just plays, maybe even better, just knight takes d6, rook takes d6, and then king g1 or g3 with some chances to hold the rook ending. But it doesn't work because Aronian plays rook to e8, rook takes e8, and still both rooks and mate are hanging, and here Carlsen had no choice but to resign. Okay, so an interesting game and some nice tactics there by Aronian. All right, game 3. Once again, Carlsen shows up here, and this is a very nice game. And here we kind of transition to a second plot line in our games. This is going to be the adventures of Carlsen against the hippopotamus, as well as the adventures of Magnus Carlsen. All right, so Kramnik plays knight f3, and here we go. Now we're in a modern of sorts. And I suppose with b5, I guess we should call this maybe a modern rather than a hippo, but it's kind of on that borderline there. I mean, with the double fianchetto and the knights on d7 and e7, pawns on e6 and d6, it's I don't know. I'm inclined to call it a hippo, but if you think that should only be the name when the pawn is on b6 rather than b5, I suppose I won't argue too much. But whatever it is, it's a provocative line. It was played quite regularly in the tournament by several different players, and Kramnik had some trouble with it. Anyway, bishop to g5 seemed to me, I mean, this whole bishop c4, bishop g5 thing is just a very classical way of going about it, but it almost seems a little naive, although it's not so bad. Anyway, Carlsen plays knight e7, and now here comes the attempted refutation. So a b, rook a8, and all right, calling it refutation is a bit much, but I think perhaps Kramnik had assumed that bishop to a8 was coming, and then he could get kind of a favorable rui. But Carlsen played a very good move here. He played queen takes a8, pressuring the pawn on e4. Now, the iffy part about this is, of course, that white can play bishop takes e7, but the center is closed, and there's really not so much that Kramnik can do by way of scraping up an attack just yet. But Kramnik tries, so he plays d5 here. He's not going to take yet, but he's trying to force Carlsen to make some kind of commitment in the center. So Carlsen could play e5 here, but that would close down both of his own bishops and take all the pressure off of white's center. So that would be perfectly fine by Kramnik. So Carlsen is consistent. He plays knight to c5, hitting the bishop, but again, ramping up the pressure against the white center too. Here, Kramnik probably should have played knight a3, but he played knight to d4. And now I think maybe Carlsen should have played knight takes b3. I don't know about should have. I mean, this is an interesting line, although it's a bit unusual in terms of the play. But here, finally, we reach a position where it's quite clear how beautifully coordinated the black pieces are, and that he has some advantage. But certainly what Carlsen played is good. So h6, takes, knight b5, and yeah, white's up a pawn, and black's king is in the center, but black has very good bishops, excellent compensation, very good Benko Gambit style compensation on the queen side. He could have played queen a1, but queen a5 is very good, protecting the pawn on c7 as well as hitting the knight. Knight c3, rook b8, takes. Okay, so after all of these moves, we have this very interesting position where white's up a pawn, but has two knights to the two bishops, and black has pressure against, well, threatening to take twice on c3, in some cases planning to take on e4, so it's murky. Probably one very safe move for Kramnik would have been queen at e3, so protecting c3 and e3, maybe preparing in some positions to play e5, also maybe rook to a1, followed by rook a4 or rook a7 could be tried in some settings. So I would say this position is approximately equal. White has a pawn, black has full compensation, but maybe not more at this point. Instead, Kramnik plays queen at g4, and I don't know if this was him just feeling optimistic and ambitious, or if he was just panicking a little bit, feeling that in the long run black's queenside pressure would prove too much, and so he would need to get some counterplay going of his own. Well, this really speeds up the disintegration of his own queenside. And in fact here, perhaps he should have just apologized and played queen to d1 to protect everything. But it's a hard move to play in Blitz, especially. So he plays rook to e3 and just kind of burns his bridges. All right, here and on the next couple of moves, there are opportunities for white to play queen takes e6 check, which he does eventually. But anyway, black is better here no matter what. Again, maybe f3, g5, and again this. But in positions like this, black is just better. The passed c-pawn will be dangerous. The black bishop will become good. Having the outermost open file is going to be a big asset for black. His king is, of course, much more active. So all of this put together gives black good winning chances. And that's what happens in the game. So Kramnik played queen e6 immediately. And here, black is in very good shape. All right, here I think Kramnik really needed to play knight to f3 to drive the king back. But he played knight to d3 check. And the idea was to play e5. But I think the whole plan is bad. Knight c1, trying to play knight e2 check and knight c3 without sacking a pawn, fails to just rook a1. So anyway, e5 is what Kramnik chose. Carlsen played a very good move. He played c4, knight f4, and now, however, Carlsen blundered. He should have played rook to a1 check, and only after king h2 played d takes e5. So instead he played d takes e5, which, as I said, was a blunder, but he got a break. So, do you see why this is a blunder? Well, Carlsen did it and Kramnik did it, so if you missed it too, don't feel bad. Knight e6 check. Only legal move is king to d5, and then knight c7 check. And after king to d4, well, if he doesn't play king to d4, then the king is further back, and white should be better in the resulting ending. After king to d4, white can either force an immediate draw with knight e6, or take and try his luck here. I'm not sure who's better, but certainly all three results are possible, and white is fine. So in the game, Kramnik blundered back with knight to e2, missing his chance. And this was kind of a nice idea. If knight takes e4, then just bishop takes, king d5, and the c-pawn is going to be too strong. So he ends up taking it anyway, but now, okay, rook a2. And here he doesn't even have to bother taking after king to g3. He just comes up. So king to d5, king d4, and the passed c-pawn is just too strong. Not to mention the fact that white's king is in trouble, too. So from here, Carlsen finishes in style. Plays bishop to f3, cutting off the king and threatening mate in 2 with g5, g5, fg5, hg5. Taking care of the king. So knight to g4 gives white the chance to just take twice on g5. But now c3. Rook d6 check, king c5, rook d8. And here, I suppose, maybe c2 immediately is also okay, but Carlsen played an elegant finish. He plays rook takes g4 check, hg, c2, and Kramnik resigns because here, in the line where he played an immediate c2 without this, white could have stopped the pawn at material cost. Here he can't stop the pawn at all. So for rook c8, bishop c6, and the pawn queens. So Kramnik resigned at this point. Okay, finally, at least in our tour of Carlsen's games, we have a quick win he had over Timur Radjabov. And this will also illustrate another one of our recurring themes on exchanging, well, a double theme. So the white dark squared bishop getting on the h4 d8 diagonal and exchanging itself for a black piece. All right, so we have an unusual French position here, but well, let me see how unusual it is. Yeah, it's fairly unusual, and it's an okay one for black though. So black is a bit passive, but there are reasonable fortress possibilities here, and that's what Radjabov is concerned to set up. Now, again, the idea is that you just, black keeps decent piece control over the dark squares with the knight on c5, the queen, the dark squared bishop, while the pawns on d5, e6, f7, g6, and h5 help to restrain white's kingside ambitions, the knight on d4, and the bishop on c2. Well, That's the plan anyway, or that's the idea, but it doesn't always work as planned. So here we go. Queen e1 and bishop f2. Again, it's paint by numbers strategy. Swap off the relevant pieces and hope for the best. So bishop a4. Black is trying to do the same thing. He wants to swap off his bad bishop for white's good bishop. And of course, white says no thank you. And now, however, white does make his exchange. Now we saw in the earlier game, I think it was the Carlsen-McShane game. McShane played bishop to f8, allowing bishop to f6, and that got him into some trouble. So Radjabov doesn't do that, but rather takes and then plays queen to d8 to make sure that no white pieces are going to go, or at least stay, on f6. So Carlsen retreats, queen e7, bishop c2, bishop a4, b3. Well, Carlsen had to do this to keep his bishop in play and to get the rook from a1 into the action, but it does make a slight weakness on c3, of course. All right, bishop to d7, a4 is kind of a nice little finesse there. Well, for one thing, in some cases it may threaten b4, but the real idea is, or one of the main ideas, is that he may just clamp down on black's queenside with a5 himself. Black could stop that by playing a5, but then he's giving up the b5 square. So a4 is a nice little finesse before black plays b5. All right, Radjabov finally decided to castle. White plays rook a to e1. And white's a little bit better, but black's position is still solid. It's tenable. But unfortunately for Radjabov, he finds the worst possible time to execute a reasonable idea. So he'd like to play knight to e4, but doing so now is perhaps a bit weakening. Well, sorry, if he does that now, then bishop takes e4, d takes e4, maybe c4. I'm not sure what he should do, actually. Maybe queen to g3. I mean, if rook e4, rook c3. So maybe he can play knight to e4 even right away. I'm not positive about that, but it's something that at some moment he may wish to do. And so he prepares it with bishop to c6. Unfortunately, this is just very, very bad timing. And see if you can figure out what white's move should do. Well, it's what every single one of white's pieces is geared to executing. f5. I mean, white's knight, bishop, queen on f2, rook on f1 are all backing it up, and the other rook protects the pawn on e5, so that way that guy won't be in danger. And of course, the idea after e takes f5 is not to just look at the pawn, but then to sacrifice a piece and break through. Well, black's position here is absolutely horrible, but g takes f5 only compounds the disaster. White played queen to g3, check, and it was already time for Radjabov to resign because he's simply getting mated. King h8, rook f5, and there's no reasonable defense to rook takes h5, checkmate. At this point, all he can do is delay the mate, but he can't stop it. Like even f6, rook h5, queen h7, rook h7 is mate because the bishop on c2 is backing up the rook. All right, so there's a quite convincing little disaster, and it shows you need to be vigilant. I mean, black set up this nice little barricade, but the problem was with all the weak dark squares in particular, and with white having such great control everywhere else, once this fortress was breached, everything just collapsed. All right, so now we move on to more of Kramnik's adventures against the hippo, or a kind of a quasi-hippo. Luke McShane had black here, and McShane, well, both McShane and Kramnik had very bad tournaments in the Blitz. McShane took last, Kramnik took next to last, and he lost to McShane. Anyway, this was an interesting game. So McShane playing very provocatively here. And notice again, Kramnik playing bishop to g5, and we'll see it again in this game. All right, so white's play is again kind of remarkably naive in a certain respect. So he's just putting all his pieces on classical squares, as if black were doing the same. And, now casting queenside as if he's just going to go and crush black, blow him off the board. But in fact, the attack that he scrapes up, that he works up, is not quite as bad as I had suspected. So king b1, knight b6. Here maybe e5, but okay, he plays h4. And this is, I think, a good move, trying to encourage McShane to make some kind of committing move over on the king side. Well, he doesn't want to allow h5 because h takes g6. Hg6 is impossible. Fg6 is positionally horrible. But if you play h5, you're giving up the g5 square forever. If you play h6, the knight is stuck on g8. All right, so McShane has another option. He plays knight f6. But now e5 comes with tempo. Here, knight e4. And finally, he plays h5 anyway. All right, but now, well, we've already seen this several times. What does white do? Of course, he plays bishop to g5. There are weak dark squares, so we swap off the dark squared bishops, and we try to take advantage. Queen d7, takes. Now, here, however, I don't really understand. I mean, well, okay, that's a bit much. I do understand what he's up to here, but I still suspect that probably rook h to e1 would have been a better choice. Black really doesn't want to take on e5 because then white can take back with the pawn and have outposts on f6, maybe d6 someday, or he can even take back with the knight, but then have c5 for the other knight. So either way, it's pretty gruesome for black. White can always take on d6. There's no rush. So I think this would have been a better choice. So instead he plays e takes d6, c6, and now rook h to e1. And the plan is clear, and in fact, McShane kind of walks into it here. So whatever black's best is, it's not king f8. So now Kramnik plays knight f to g5, and here I think black should have played either bishop to c8 or knight to c4 to encourage the exchange of white's potentially very good bishop. So for instance, well, I won't for instance, I'll show you how the game went. So rook to e8, but now Kramnik misses his chance. So he's built up, he said A, he said B, but he doesn't say C. What he should have done is played knight takes f7. This is what all his pieces are aimed at, but failing to do this, then white's setup loses its logic, and McShane starts taking over. All right, after knight f7, if queen f7, then knight takes d6 is winning material. So king f7, knight g5, king g7, rook takes e6. And now we're hitting g6. And that, in turn, is why knight c4 would have been a good idea. So if you have this position, well, but with the bishop on d3 gone, the knight on b6 gone, and the black pawn on c4 instead, this is not really any big deal. There's no threat to take on g6, so black is simply up a piece for 2 pawns. Here, though, taking on g6 is a big deal. So black would probably have to give up the queen here. And now one interesting idea for white is to play rook to g1 with the idea of g4 and probably some advantage. Well, as I said, instead Kramnik played knight to g3, kind of reloading, but it's far from obvious what this knight is doing on g3. It's just not well placed at all. All right, so McShane was able to finish quasi-castling here with king of g7, and now he's okay. Bishop e4, queen f6, getting the queen off the line with the white rook, and fighting for the f4 square. Queen c1, b4, and now things are going very nicely for black. Rook d3, queen d8, rook f3. So here, though, Kramnik has found a way to keep some hope alive, he thinks, and here, after f5, this time Kramnik decides it is time to go blasting away, but now black is just very well prepared for it, and bishop takes f5 is just the triumph of wishful thinking over objectivity. After e takes f5, sacrificing on f5 is just it's just not going to work. It's magical thinking. So knight e6 check, takes, and materially white is okay. I mean, he's got a rook and a pawn for 2 pieces, but this is really a position where the 2 minor pieces are much more important. Well, after bishop to c8, if the rook retreats, then black probably plays f4, and then bishop f5 or bishop to g4, and really white's position is quite poor. So he tried knight takes f5, gf5, and then rook to g3 check, but here he either resigned or lost on time. The thing is, after king f7, and then next queen takes h4, I mean, it's just hopeless for white. Black has 3 minor pieces for just a rook and a pawn, or that's what it will be after he plays queen takes h4. and white has no attack. So another interesting try by Kramnik, but again, at a key moment, he kind of lost his nerve. And then when he finally did kind of work his nerve up to make a sack, it was in a poor situation for that to give up material. Okay, well, finally we have Kramnik's success. This time it's against Timur Radjabov, round 6, and this time he works his way through this the hippo and the problems there. Okay, notice no bishop to g5 just yet. And in fact, here it's been prevented. But to compensate, I suppose, Kramnik plays bishop to b5 check, hoping for c6, which would weaken in a significant way the solidity of this this setup. So Radjabov just retracts the knight back to d7. Okay, bishop e3, a6, bishop d3, and now the knight goes back to f6. All right, well, we don't want to allow knight to g4, so h3 is the move, queen d7, and now queen to d2, preventing kingside castling. It's also worth considering a move like c4, both preparing, well, giving him more options for central play, and also perhaps trying to scare black from any possibilities of castling queenside. Anyway, he played queen to d2 to prevent kingside castling. Radjabov played d5. And now bishop to f4 is not a bad move, but knight e5 as played by Kramnik is also quite decent. One funny idea here for black is that he could play knight takes e4 and then bishop takes e5, but played more normally with queen to d8. Kramnik plays f3, protecting the e4 pawn, and making sure that he can keep a pawn there in the center. All right, knight to d7, so again the knight goes back. Knight to g4, and I like this. So now he's hitting the pawn on h6, and he's really forcing a bit of a crisis for black. Black is going to have to make some kind of decision here and make some kind of commitment with his kingside pawns, which is something that he generally tries to avoid in this opening. So after h5, now white can again play on the dark squares. So we've seen this a bunch of times, including in Radjabov's game with Carlsen, where it was a French defense, but still he had that little pawn V formation, the geese flying over there on the king side, with the pawns on d5, e6, f7, g6, and h5. All right, Kramnik could go with either piece to h6, but he played knight f2. And now Radjabov correctly played c5, so fighting for counterplay and trying to open the center before white can do anything too dastardly on the king side. Okay, Kramnik played rook a to d1. Black might have castled here, but he just chops off these central pawns. And now he castles. Maybe it would have been safer to play rook to c8 here and wait, but okay, he castles, and now Kramnik finally makes the attack work. So he plays e5, which is a good move. Here, black really needed to play f6. It's an ugly looking move to play. It clearly, it weakens the e6 pawn, it weakens the g6 pawn, but if he doesn't do this, he's going to have no squares and just get scrunched and get killed on the king side. Well, he played knight f5, and now Kramnik makes his favorite move, bishop to g5. All right, again, black needed to play f6 to fight for those key dark squares, but played queen to e8. And now, here comes the recipe, right? So we trade off the pieces, the right pieces. Knight f5. Here, probably black needed to play g takes f5 to keep the center under control. But he played e takes f5. And now, white could have played e6 and then bishop c4. This is winning. But Kramnik's slightly slower way is also sufficient. So bishop c4, king h7. Again, e6 is possible, but just calmly plays bishop to b3. Okay, queen to b8. Knight to d3, just improving the position. a5, knight f4, and all of his pieces are on their best squares. Okay, a4. If f6 here, then takes, and rook e7, and now it's just more trouble with moves like knight e6 coming. So a4, bishop c2, and here knight takes h5 is about to happen, but maybe something like g4 would also be good. But anyway, knight h5 is just so obvious and so strong. black has no way to hold it together. So he tried, well, okay, before we see what he tried, let's say he plays rook to c8. Well, knight h5. If queen to c7, maybe knight h5 is okay here too, but at least the queen on c7 protects the knight on d7. So maybe white should play rook to c1, frighten the queen away, and then play knight h5. Well, Radjabov played bishop to e4, so he doesn't want to allow bishop takes f5 check after knight h5, gh5. But Kramnik just played rook takes e4, and here Radjabov resigned because after takes, threatening the rook on a8, and after rook a5 can also improve this guy too. And here instead of knight takes h5, maybe even better is bishop to d5. There's no defense to the threat of bishop takes f7, at least no good defense. So, you know, it's kind of a target practice situation for white, and Radjabov had enough after f takes e4, or maybe he lost on time, but his position is completely lost. Okay, last one, and this is with Caruana against Aronian. So here we have something more or less completely different from what we've seen. So we've had these a lot of hippos. We've seen this black setting up this pawn structure with all the guys on light squares, and white playing bishop g5 and trying to trade off the right pieces. None of that this time. Although actually we do have bishop to g5 here as well, but other than that, it's not the same. So Caruana against Aronian. Aronian plays the Berlin, and here, Caruana plays this sideline with bishop to g5. And I have to say, I've been playing this quite a bit this year, at least in Blitz games against the Berlin, and I've had pretty good results with it. Actually, very good results. Although I don't objectively think it promises much of anything. But the reason why I kind of like it is that even though black gets to castle, you know, so he doesn't get the awkward king, and get rid of one of the bishops. Well, okay, so this is the main position that you get, and so you get rid of one of the bishops. And what I often try to get in here is something like queen e2, a3, rook a to d1, queen e4. Not necessarily playing a3. Sometimes I play that if I feel like I need to stop queen to b4 for tactical reasons in a given position. And anyway, it's just where you can just squeeze a little bit. It's not much, but it's something, and it avoids the ending, at least when you're feeling a little bit lazy. Well, I think black should castle kingside. This really seems to me the right way to play, and it's what I've generally faced against when strong players have been on the black side against me, and I think it's recommended kingside castling, that is, by Lisi and Ovechkin in their book on the Berlin. Although I might be misremembering. Maybe they recommend f6 in this position, which is very, very complicated but playable. But I think it's Kritz in his chess-based DVD where he gives a very quick repertoire on the Berlin. I think he says that black should just play bishop to d7 and castle, and he just leaves it at that. Now, in general, I think that he does a pretty good job on that DVD. It's not going to teach you everything you ever need to know about the Berlin, but it's not a bad little presentation. But there are some small flaws in the DVD, I think, and this, I would say, is probably one of them, if I'm remembering right, if it's indeed him who says this. And I think the problem is what we see in the game. So bishop to d7, queen e2, castles, and here I'm not sure about the game. So all that's given is rook a to d1, king b8, b4, and it notes the white wins. I suspect, of course, well, I think it's obvious that the game went for much longer than this, and I suspect that what happened is that probably here Caruana put the rook on d1 and then decided instead to put it on b1, and that somehow his doing this created kind of a DGTR, and I'm suspecting that in fact the other rook ended up on d1, so the score just ends at this point. But this plan of putting a rook on b1 and playing b4, b5 against this kind of pawn structure goes back to at least Fischer. I remember Fischer had a game in the Exchange Rui where he used this plan, and it proved crushingly effective. I think it goes back even before that, though. I have this vague recollection of either a Capablanca or an Emanuel Lasker game with that plan as well. I might be misremembering, but I think that's right, and I'm pretty sure that Fisher used it. Anyway, it seems that that's something like what happened in this game, and so I just want to turn you on to that plan. It's something that you can use with white, both here and against the Exchange Rui in variations where black castle's long. And of course, if you play the Berlin, you should be aware of this. So, especially those of you who may have that Kritz disc and are following his advice. So, be careful if you do that. All right, so that will bring this show to an end. So those were the games that caught my eye. I hope you found them interesting and entertaining. Learned a little bit. You don't have to learn too much since these were only Blitz games. But if you can learn something, you might as well do it. All right, so I will see you next time with a different topic. And until then, have a great week. Take care. Bye-bye.